The quiet life. Jake Morgan woke up to the soft glow of the morning sun spilling through the curtains of his modest bedroom. The faint chirping of birds outside the window was a soothing melody that had become the soundtrack to his new life. This small, tranquil town of Willow Creek was a haven, a stark contrast to the chaotic life he had once lived. As he stretched, the familiar ache in his shoulder reminded him of the years he'd spent in grueling conditions. It was a subtle but constant echo of a past he rarely spoke of, one filled with missions in hostile territories and decisions that had shaped his very being. But here, in Willow Creek, he wasn't Jake, the Green Beret captain with a reputation for being unbreakable. He was just Jake Morgan, the quiet man who ran the town's only carpentry shop. Jake glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was 6:15 a.m., a time he had internalized from years of strict routines. He rose from the bed, pulling on a simple plaid shirt and worn jeans before heading downstairs. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, courtesy of the timer he had set the night before. He poured himself a mug, savoring the warmth as he leaned against the counter. The house was silent for now, his children still asleep. Emma, his 16-year-old daughter, was a diligent student with a knack for sketching designs and dreams of becoming an architect. Liam, his 10-year-old son, was a ball of energy who loved tinkering with anything mechanical. They were his anchor, the reason he had traded a life of peril for one of stability. Jake stepped onto the front porch with his coffee, letting the cool morning air brush against his face. The porch swing creaked softly as he sat down, gazing out at the peaceful street. The town was just beginning to stir, with a few neighbors walking their dogs and the occasional car humming past. It was the kind of life he had fought to create, one where his children could grow up free from fear. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A jogger passed by, waving. Jake returned the gesture with a nod and a faint smile, his typical response to friendly interactions. He didn't talk much, and most people in town respected that. They liked Jake for his quiet reliability and his unassuming nature. What they didn't know was that his silence wasn't shyness. It was discipline, a skill honed over years of knowing when to speak and when to observe. Inside, Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her long brown hair tied in a messy ponytail. She yawned as she poured herself a bowl of cereal, shooting a glance at the clock. "You're up early," Jake said, stepping back inside. "Morning shift at the diner," she replied, her voice still groggy. Jake nodded. Emma worked weekends at Willow Creek's one and only diner, a spot popular with locals and travelers alike. She was saving up for her first car, and Jake admired her determination. It reminded him of her mother, a woman who had been gone for nearly a decade, but whose spirit lived on in their children. "Liam's still asleep?" Emma asked, glancing toward the stairs. Jake chuckled. "Probably dreaming about rockets again. I'll wake him up soon." Emma smirked before grabbing her backpack and heading for the door. "See you later, Dad." Jake watched her leave, pride swelling in his chest. Emma had grown up fast after her mother's passing, taking on responsibilities most kids her age didn't have to face. Liam, on the other hand, was still blissfully unaware of the sacrifices his family had made to keep their lives running smoothly. Jake spent the morning tending to his carpentry shop, a small but steady business that catered to the town's needs. From fixing chairs to crafting custom shelves, Jake's work was in high demand. The shop was filled with the scent of sawdust and varnish, a comforting smell that grounded him. As he sanded down a piece of oak, he couldn't help but notice the slight twitch of his instincts, a nagging feeling he had learned never to ignore. It started with small details. A black SUV parked outside the shop for too long. A man in a leather jacket pacing by the entrance without entering. Jake's years of experience told him these weren't random occurrences. He didn't react outwardly, but his mind cataloged every detail. He had spent years honing his ability to notice the smallest inconsistencies, and it wasn't a skill that faded easily. By noon, the feeling had grown stronger. A group of 3 men walked into the shop, their demeanor casual but their eyes sharp. They browsed without saying much, their movements deliberate. Jake greeted them with his usual calm tone. "Need help finding anything?" he asked. The tallest of the three, a man with a scar running down his cheek, gave Jake a lazy smile. "Just looking," he said. Jake nodded, stepping back behind the counter. He kept his expression neutral, but his senses were on high alert. These weren't locals. Their clothes were too new, their attitudes too cocky. They didn't belong in Willow Creek. After a few minutes, the men left, but not before Scarface turned and said, "Nice place you've got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." Jake watched them go, his expression unchanged. He knew a threat when he heard one. That evening, as Jake sat at the dinner table with Emma and Liam, the events of the day weighed heavily on his mind. Liam chattered excitedly about a science project he was working on, while Emma teased him about turning the house into a lab. Jake joined in their laughter, but a part of him remained distant. When the kids were asleep, Jake returned to the porch. The night was quiet, but his instincts told him that trouble was brewing. He had seen men like Scarface before, predators who thrived on intimidation. Jake had spent years neutralizing threats like them in foreign territories, but now they had come to his town. He couldn't afford to let them think they had the upper hand. Willow Creek was his sanctuary, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. As he stared into the darkened street, his resolve hardened. Jake Morgan wasn't just a quiet man who fixed things. He was a protector, a survivor, and if push came to shove, he was ready to remind the world of who he truly was. Shadows in the town. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the small town of Willow Creek into the soft embrace of twilight. Streetlights flickered on one by one, their yellow glow illuminating quiet streets. Jake Morgan sat on the front porch of his modest home, his sharp eyes scanning the street with practiced calm. His hand rested lightly on the arm of the porch swing, the gentle creak of its chains filling the still night air. He looked every bit the small-town craftsman winding down after a long day, but beneath that calm exterior, his mind was razor-sharp. The men who had visited his shop earlier were no random customers. Jake had seen their kind before, men who thrived on fear and used intimidation to get what they wanted. They reminded him of the gang leaders and insurgents he had faced during his time as a Green Beret. These men operated on a simple principle: dominate through fear. Jake understood that all too well, but he also knew their type could crumble when that fear was turned back on them. The soft thud of paws on the wooden porch broke his concentration. Max, their loyal German Shepherd mix, padded up to him and rested his head on Jake's knee. Jake absently scratched behind the dog's ears, his gaze still fixed on the street. Max was a good dog, alert, loyal, and protective. He was also Jake's first line of defense. "Good boy," Jake murmured as he gave Max a final pat and stood. The quiet night didn't fool him. Trouble was coming. He could feel it. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him and double-checking the windows. His children, Emma and Liam, were upstairs, likely in their rooms. He could hear the faint hum of music from Emma's room and the excited chatter of Liam, talking to himself as he worked on his latest project. Jake leaned against the kitchen counter, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood. He had worked hard to create a life of peace and safety for his family, but it seemed the shadows of his past had finally caught up with him. He thought about the three men who had entered his shop earlier, the threat in their words as clear as the scar on the leader's face. Later that evening, Jake decided to pay a visit to the diner where Emma worked part-time. He wanted to make sure she was safe. Walking through the quiet streets, he kept his head low, but his eyes scanned every corner, every alley, every parked car. Years of military experience had conditioned him to be hyper-aware of his surroundings. Willow Creek was no battlefield, but he treated it as one now. The diner was still buzzing when he arrived. Locals chatted over coffee and pie, while the occasional traveler passed through for a meal. Jake stepped inside, the smell of grilled burgers and fried onions greeting him. He spotted Emma behind the counter, her warm smile lighting up her face as she served a table of regulars. She caught his eye and gave a small wave before returning to her work. Jake approached the counter, nodding to the waitress on duty, and took a seat at the far end, where he could observe the room. It was something he always did: choose the seat with the best vantage point, the one closest to the exits. Old habits, he thought, die hard. Half an hour passed uneventfully, but then the atmosphere changed. The faint roar of motorcycle engines echoed from outside, growing louder as they approached. Jake's muscles tensed instinctively. Moments later, the same 3 men from his shop earlier strolled in, their leather jackets and confident strides making it clear they weren't here for the food. Scarface led the group, his sharp eyes scanning the diner before landing on Emma. His smirk widened as he sauntered over to the counter, tapping it lightly to get her attention. "Hey there, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice carrying enough volume to make nearby patrons glance over. "How about a coffee? And maybe a smile to go with it." Emma froze for a split second before forcing a polite expression. "Of course. One coffee coming up." Jake's hand tightened around his mug, his calm exterior hiding the storm brewing inside him. He had seen enough to know these men weren't just passing through. They were testing boundaries, looking for weak spots. And now, they were targeting his daughter. Scarface leaned on the counter, his tone turning more suggestive as Emma set the coffee down in front of him. "You work here often. Must get a lot of guys coming in just to see you." Emma didn't respond, instead focusing on wiping the counter. Jake's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, standing slowly and making his way toward the men. "Something I can help you with?" Jake's voice cut through the room, calm and steady, but with an edge that made Scarface straighten slightly. The man turned to face him, his smirk faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "Well, if it isn't the handyman. Didn't know you were a regular here." Jake didn't smile. "My daughter works here. Thought I'd stop by." Scarface's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your daughter, huh? She's got her old man watching over her." "How sweet." The other 2 men chuckled, but Jake didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his presence alone enough to shift the mood in the room. "You've made your point," Jake said, his tone low but firm. "You don't belong here. Time to move on." Scarface narrowed his eyes, his bravado flickering. He was used to people backing down, not standing firm. "We were just having a coffee," he said, his voice quieter now. "And now you're done," Jake replied evenly. "You can leave." For a moment, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The 2 men behind Scarface shifted uncomfortably, waiting for their leader's cue. Scarface held Jake's gaze, searching for any sign of weakness. He found none. With a shrug that was meant to look casual, Scarface stepped back. "Fine," he said, raising his hands. "We'll see ourselves out." The 3 men turned and left, their exit punctuated by the roar of their motorcycles. The diner fell silent, all eyes on Jake. He nodded to Emma, who looked both relieved and confused, before quietly leaving the diner. The walk home was uneventful, but Jake's mind raced. He had sent a clear message, but he knew men like Scarface wouldn't back down easily. They would see his resistance as a challenge, and they'd return stronger, more determined. When he got home, he found Max waiting for him at the door, his tail wagging. Jake knelt down, scratching the dog's head. "We've got work to do, boy," he murmured. That night, Jake began making preparations. He reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, installed motion sensor lights around the property, and brought out the tools he hadn't touched in years. His military training was a part of him, and he knew how to use it. Jake's past had taught him that the best defense was a good offense. He wasn't going to wait for the trouble to escalate. He would be ready. And when the time came, Scarface and his crew would learn the hard way that they had picked the wrong family to mess with. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Jake sat on the porch with Max by his side, his gaze steady and unyielding. Trouble was coming to Willow Creek, but Jake was no stranger to storms, And this time, he wasn't going to let it take anything from him. The warning. The sun rose over Willow Creek, bathing the town in golden light, but Jake Morgan wasn't basking in the beauty of the morning. He was in the backyard, sharpening an old axe with slow, deliberate strokes. His hands moved methodically, the rhythm soothing as his mind worked through the events of the previous night. The encounter with Scarface and his crew at the diner had made one thing clear. They weren't going to stop. Jake had seen it in the man's eyes. He was a predator, used to having his way, and the subtle defiance Jake had shown would only make him more determined to assert dominance. Scarface wasn't just testing boundaries. He was looking for an excuse to escalate. Max lay in the grass nearby, his ears perked up and his eyes trained on the street beyond the fence. The dog was as alert as his owner, sensing the tension in the air. Jake finished with the axe and set it aside, wiping his hands on a rag. He glanced toward the house, where Emma and Liam were still sleeping. The morning was peaceful, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. By mid-morning, the town began to stir, its streets filling with the usual hum of small-town life. Jake headed into his carpentry shop to prepare for the day's work. The shop was his sanctuary, a place where he could focus on something tangible, something that didn't require the constant vigilance he was accustomed to. But as he unlocked the door and stepped inside, his instincts flared. Something was off. The shop was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. Jake scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place, but as he stepped closer to the counter, he noticed the note. A single sheet of paper, folded neatly, sat on the counter. Jake picked it up, his fingers steady as he unfolded it. The message was short but chilling. Back off, or next time. It won't just be a warning. Jake's jaw tightened. The handwriting was jagged, the kind of scrawl that spoke of haste or anger. He folded the note again and tucked it into his pocket. This was no idle threat. Scarface and his crew were making their move. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the note weighed heavily on Jake's mind. He couldn't afford to dismiss it, but he also couldn't afford to overreact. The safety of his family and the town depended on his ability to handle the situation with precision. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Jake left the shop and walked toward the diner. Emma's shift was almost over, and he wanted to make sure she got home safely. The streets of Willow Creek were as quiet as ever, but Jake's eyes flicked from side to side, scanning for any signs of trouble. When he reached the diner, he spotted Emma through the window, wiping down tables as the last few customers finished their meals. She caught his eye and waved, a small smile breaking through the weariness on her face. Jake nodded, his usual silent greeting. He leaned against a lamppost outside, watching the street. The steady hum of an approaching motorcycle made him stiffen. Moments later, a single rider came into view, his leather jacket gleaming in the fading sunlight. Jake recognized him immediately, one of Scarface's crew. The man didn't stop but slowed down as he passed the diner, his head turning slightly to meet Jake's gaze. Jake didn't flinch. He held the man's stare until the motorcycle sped up again, disappearing around the corner. It was a message, plain and simple. They were washing. Back at home, Jake gathered Emma and Liam in the living room after dinner. Liam sat cross-legged on the rug, fiddling with a small model airplane, while Emma perched on the edge of the couch, her arms crossed. "Is something wrong, Dad?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with concern. She had noticed the tension in her father's demeanor, and the way he seemed to be watching the world more closely than usual. Jake took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees. "I need you both to listen carefully," he began, his tone calm but firm. "There are some people in town who might try to cause trouble. I don't want you to worry, but I need you to be cautious." Emma's brow furrowed. "What kind of trouble? Is this about those guys at the diner?" Jake nodded slowly. "They're not good people. They think they can intimidate us, but they're wrong. Still, I need you to be extra careful. Don't go anywhere alone. And if you see anything unusual, come straight home." Liam looked up, his wide eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of fear. "Are they bad guys, Dad?" Jake smiled faintly, ruffling his son's hair. "They're just bullies, Liam. And we don't let bullies win, do we?" Liam shook his head, his small hands clenching into fists. "No, we don't." Emma, however, wasn't so easily reassured. "Dad, what are you going to do? You're not seriously thinking of taking them on by yourself, are you?" Jake met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'll do what I have to, Emma. But you don't need to worry about that. Just focus on staying safe." Emma opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the steely resolve in her father's eyes. She had seen that look before, rare but unmistakable. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind. That night, as the house settled into silence, Jake sat in the garage, his thoughts racing. The note had been a warning, but he knew it was only the beginning. Scarface and his crew wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and Jake couldn't allow that to happen. He opened a weathered metal chest tucked away in the corner, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. Inside was a collection of tools he hadn't touched in a long time, items that spoke of a life he had tried to leave behind. A tactical flashlight, a multi-tool, and a sturdy combat knife lay neatly arranged, alongside a small notebook filled with old mission plans and notes. Jake picked up the knife, its weight familiar in his hand. He turned it over slowly, the blade catching the dim light of the garage. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but he wasn't naive either. Sometimes, to protect what mattered most, you had to be willing to fight. He set the knife aside and began sketching a map of the town, marking key locations and possible entry points for trouble. He wasn't just preparing for a confrontation. He was preparing to end this before it could escalate further. He had spent years honing his skills, learning to think 2 steps ahead of his enemies. Now he would put those skills to use once more. As the first light of dawn broke over Willow Creek, Jake stood on the porch, his gaze steady and unyielding. The town was quiet, but Jake knew the storm was coming. He had chosen this life of peace, but if Scarface and his crew thought they could take it from him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The first strike. The morning air in Willow Creek was crisp and still as Jake Morgan walked into his shop, unlocking the door with deliberate calm. The streets were quiet, just as he expected. But beneath the peaceful veneer, the tension that had gripped him for days simmered. Jake was no stranger to the feeling. It was the calm before the storm, and he knew it well. Inside the shop, the smell of fresh-cut wood and varnish greeted him. He moved through the aisles, taking stock of his tools and inventory, though his mind was far from carpentry. The note Scarface and his crew had left behind weighed on him, not for its threat, but for the implication. They were testing him, seeing how far they could push. Jake had dealt with men like them before, men who mistook silence for weakness. He would show them the error of their thinking, but on his terms. By mid-morning, Jake decided it was time to put his plan into action. He wasn't going to wait for Scarface to strike again. The gang's power relied on their ability to intimidate and control through fear. Jake's strategy was simple: dismantle their operation piece by piece, forcing them to react instead of act. It was a strategy he had employed countless times in the military, and it worked every time. He started with their presence in the town. Jake had spent the last few days quietly observing their movements, tracking their routines and habits. Scarface and his men were creatures of predictability, and predictability was a liability Jake could exploit. That afternoon, Jake parked his truck a block away from an old warehouse at the edge of town. It was a rundown building, its windows covered with grime and its walls peppered with graffiti. From his observations, Jake had learned this was one of Scarface's key meeting spots. He had watched them come and go, using the building as a base to plan their next moves. Jake adjusted the cap on his head and walked toward the warehouse, blending into the surroundings like a shadow. He wasn't carrying much, just a crowbar tucked discreetly into his jacket and a pair of gloves. As he approached the side entrance, he scanned the area for cameras or lookouts. Finding none, he slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with crates and rusted metal shelves lining the walls. It smelled of oil and stale cigarettes. Jake moved silently, his steps precise and calculated. Years of training had taught him how to navigate unfamiliar terrain without leaving a trace. He found what he was looking for in the back corner of the warehouse, a stash of contraband. Crates filled with stolen goods, from electronics to tools, were stacked haphazardly. Nearby, a table was cluttered with cash, ledgers, and packets of drugs. This was their operation hub, their lifeblood. Jake got to work. Using the crowbar, he pried open the crates, scattering their contents across the floor. He emptied the packets of drugs into a nearby drain and left the ledgers torn to shreds. Finally, he doused the pile of stolen goods with motor oil from a nearby canister, rendering them unsalvageable. As he worked, Jake remained hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound made his muscles tense. But the warehouse remained silent. When he was done, he left the way he came, ensuring there were no signs of his presence apart from the destruction he had wrought. Later that evening, Jake sat on his front porch, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. The street was quiet, but he knew the gang would discover his handiwork soon. He didn't have to wait long. By nightfall, the sound of motorcycles shattered the peace. Jake watched as a group of riders tore down the street, their engines growling like predators on the hunt. He remained seated, his expression calm, but his mind raced. They wouldn't come directly to his house. Not yet. They didn't know for sure who was responsible, but they would suspect. Jake's gamble had paid off. He had struck a nerve. The next day, whispers of the gang's anger spread through town. Locals who had once avoided eye contact with Jake now stopped him in the street, their voices hushed but urgent. "Did you hear about the warehouse?" Mrs. Thompson asked as Jake helped her load supplies into her truck. "Someone hit them hard. They're furious." Jake nodded, his expression neutral. Trouble like that doesn't last long in a town like ours. He didn't say more, but the gleam in his eye hinted at his satisfaction. He knew the gang's operations were unraveling, and Scarface would be scrambling to regain control. Desperation made people sloppy, and Jake planned to use that to his advantage. That evening, Jake noticed a black SUV parked down the street from his house. Its tinted windows gave no indication of who was inside, but Jake didn't need to see them to know. Scarface was watching, trying to figure out his next move. Jake stayed inside, keeping the lights low as he worked on reinforcing the house. He installed new locks on the doors, added motion sensor lights to the yard, and prepared a few surprises in case the gang decided to get bold. As the week went on, Jake's quiet campaign continued. He sabotaged the gang's vehicles, slashing tires and removing spark plugs under the cover of darkness. He spread false information through carefully crafted whispers, making them question their own members' loyalty. He left no trail, no evidence, just a growing sense of unease that rippled through their ranks. The town began to change as well. Inspired by Jake's quiet defiance, other residents started standing up to the gang. Shop owners refused to pay protection money, and neighbors began organizing wash groups. The gang's grip on Willow Creek was slipping, and they knew it. Scarface's frustration boiled over one night as he gathered his crew in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. His scared face twisted with anger as he slammed a fist on the table. "Who the hell is doing this?" he growled, his voice a low snarl. "Someone in this town thinks they're clever, but they're dead wrong." The gang members exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen Scarface like this, uncertain, on edge. He had built his reputation on control, and now that control was unraveling. Deke, one of the younger members, spoke up hesitantly. "What if it's the guy from the diner? The one with the hardware shop?" Scarface's eyes narrowed. "Morgan?" "Yeah," Deke said, fidgeting. "There's something about him. He doesn't scare easy. Scarface leaned back in his chair, his mind working. If it's him, we make sure he regrets it. Nobody messes with us. That night, Jake sat in his garage, reviewing his plans. He knew Scarface would come for him eventually. And when they did, he would be ready. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his family and his town. Scarface and his crew had no idea who they were up against, but they were about to find out. The reckoning. The cool night air carried a heavy stillness, the kind that preceded a storm. Jake Morgan stood on the back porch of his home, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened street beyond the yard. The faint hum of crickets filled the silence, but Jake's focus was elsewhere. He could feel it in his gut. Scarface and his crew were done testing. The escalation was inevitable. Max, his loyal German Shepherd mix, sat by his side, ears perked and alert. The dog sensed the tension in Jake's body, mirroring his readiness. Jake reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, his mind already racing through contingency plans. "Not tonight," he murmured to the dog. But soon. Inside, the house was quiet. Emma and Liam were already asleep, their breathing soft and rhythmic in their rooms upstairs. Jake had done everything he could to prepare them without alarming them. He had reinforced the locks, installed a new security system, and even showed Emma a few basic escape routes, disguising it as emergency preparedness. As he moved through the house, Jake's eyes lingered on a photo of his late wife on the living room mantel. She smiled back at him, a reminder of everything he had sworn to protect. He reached out, brushing the edge of the frame with his fingertips. "I'll keep them safe," he whispered, his voice firm. "No matter what." The next morning, Jake walked into town, his demeanor calm, but his mind sharp. He made his way to the hardware shop, opening for the day as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But the moment he stepped inside, he noticed the change. A stack of paint cans had been knocked over, their contents smeared across the floor. The front counter was covered in deep gouges, as if someone had taken a knife to it. On the wall behind the counter, written in bright red spray paint, were the words, "This is your last warning." Jake's jaw tightened. He stared at the message for a moment, then reached for a rag and a can of solvent. Methodically, he began scrubbing the paint from the wall, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't bother calling the police. They wouldn't be able to help him with what was coming. As he worked, he thought about the men who had done this. Scarface was testing him, trying to bait him into reacting. But Jake wasn't a man who reacted. He acted, and when he did, it was with precision. By midday, the town was buzzing with rumors. People whispered about the graffiti, the gang, and Jake's stoic response. Mrs. Harper from the bakery stopped by to check on him, her face lined with worry. "You need to tell someone, Jake," she urged. "They're dangerous." "I've got it under control," Jake replied, his tone steady but final. Mrs. Harper looked unconvinced, but she didn't press further. She had known Jake long enough to trust his judgment, even if she didn't fully understand it. That evening, Jake stood on the porch again, watching as a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. Its windows were tinted, but Jake didn't need to see inside to know who it was. The vehicle paused briefly in front of his house before continuing on, its engine humming ominously in the night. "They're testing me," Jake muttered to himself. He clenched his fists, then released them, forcing himself to stay calm. He had faced far worse threats in his past. Scarface and his crew didn't scare him. They just made him angry. Jake didn't wait for them to strike first. Over the next few days, he began dismantling their operation with quiet efficiency. He sabotaged their vehicles, cutting brake lines and puncturing tires under the cover of darkness. He intercepted shipments of stolen goods, replacing them with useless junk. He even left subtle warnings of his own, a crowbar embedded in the hood of their leader's car, a trail of destroyed merchandise leading to their meeting spots. The gang grew paranoid, their once cocky demeanor replaced with uncertainty. Scarface held emergency meetings, barking orders at his crew. But the damage was done. They were no longer in control. They were reacting, and Jake was pulling the strings. One night, Scarface decided to make his move. Jake had anticipated it. He knew they would come for him, and he had prepared every inch of his property for the encounter. Motion-activated lights lined the yard, and subtle traps were hidden in plain sight. Jake had even enlisted Max, who had been trained in obedience and defense. Around midnight, Jake heard the first sound, the low rumble of motorcycles in the distance. He stood in the living room, his heart steady, his mind clear. He glanced at the security monitor he had installed, watching as the gang approached the house. There were 6 of them, led by Scarface himself. They parked their bikes at the curb, their figures silhouetted against the streetlights. Jake turned off the monitor and walked to the kitchen. He retrieved a crowbar from the counter and a flashlight from the drawer. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to shy away from one either. Scarface and his crew split up, moving toward the house from different angles. Jake watched from the shadows as one of them approached the side gate. The man didn't see the tripwire until it was too late. A loud clatter echoed as a bucket of nails and bolts tumbled from above, scattering across the ground. The man cursed, stumbling backward. The distraction worked. Jake used the moment to move, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. He found another gang member trying to pry open a window. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed the man by the collar and yanked him to the ground. A single well-placed blow knocked him out cold. Scarface, meanwhile, was at the front of the house, shouting orders. "Find him. Bring him out here." Jake moved silently, his military training guiding every step. He circled around the gang, taking out another member near the garage. Max, sensing the tension, stayed close, his teeth bared in a low growl. By the time Scarface realized what was happening, 3 of his men were already down. Jake stepped out of the shadows, his crowbar glinting in the moonlight. "Looking for me," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. Scarface turned, his scared face twisted in fury. "You think you can take us all on, old man?" Jake didn't respond. He simply raised the crowbar, his stance steady. The remaining gang members hesitated, their confidence shaken. They weren't used to being challenged, let alone outmaneuvered. "You've made a mistake," Scarface growled, stepping closer. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Neither do you." The fight that followed was brutal but swift. Jake's experience and discipline gave him the upper hand, his movements precise and controlled. He disarmed one man with a single strike and sent another sprawling with a well-timed kick. Max leaped into the fray, taking down the last gang member with a ferocious snarl. Finally, it was just Jake and Scarface. The gang leader lunged, but Jake sidestepped, using Scarface's momentum against him. In seconds, Scarface was on the ground, gasping for breath as Jake loomed over him. "This is my town," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "You don't belong here." Scarface glared up at him but said nothing. Jake stepped back, allowing the gang leader to crawl to his feet. "Leave," Jake said, "and don't come back." Scarface hesitated, his pride warring with his fear, but eventually he staggered toward his bike, his crew following in defeat. They roared off into the night, their power shattered. As the silence returned, Jake stood in the yard, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. Max trotted up to him, his tail wagging slightly. Jake knelt down, patting the dog's head. "It's over," he said softly, though he knew the truth. It wasn't just over. It was a warning to anyone else who thought they could take what Jake had fought so hard to protect. Inside the house, Emma and Liam remained asleep, unaware of the battle that had unfolded outside. Jake locked the doors and settled into a chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the quiet street. He had won this round, but he would stay vigilant. Willow Creek was his home, and Jake Morgan would do whatever it took to keep it safe. Aftermath and reflection. The street was eerily quiet after Scarface and his crew retreated. Jake stood in the yard for a moment longer, listening to the fading rumble of motorcycles disappearing into the distance. His grip on the crowbar loosened as the adrenaline began to fade, but his senses remained sharp. He scanned the shadows, making sure there were no stragglers left behind. Max nudged Jake's leg, his ears twitching. The dog's unwavering presence was a comfort, but Jake knew better than to let his guard down completely. He crouched down to Max's level, rubbing the dog's neck gently. "Good job, buddy," he murmured. "Stay sharp for a little while longer." With Max by his side, Jake moved through the yard, checking the areas where he had set up traps. He retrieved the fallen bucket of nails, collected any debris from the fight, and ensured no evidence of the encounter remained. By the time he was done, the yard looked as pristine as it had earlier that day. Jake had learned long ago the importance of erasing signs of conflict, leaving no trail for anyone to follow. Back inside the house, Jake placed the crowbar back in its spot on the garage wall. He turned off the motion-activated lights and secured every lock on the doors and windows. His preparations had paid off tonight, but he knew this wasn't the end. Men like Scarface rarely stayed down for long. There was always the risk they would regroup, seeking revenge. Jake stepped into the living room and sank into his armchair. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house were the only sounds. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of the night settle over him. Memories of his past missions flickered in his mind, moments of survival, choices that had saved lives but left scars. Tonight had felt like one of those moments, but this time, it wasn't about protecting a team or completing a mission. It was about his family, his home, and his town. The next morning, the town seemed unaware of the battle that had taken place the night before. Neighbors waved as Jake left his house, and children played on the sidewalks as if nothing had changed. But Jake knew better. Word would spread eventually, and the gang's retreat wouldn't go unnoticed. At the hardware shop, Jake found Mrs. Thompson waiting by the door, holding a basket of muffins. Her face was lined with worry, but she managed a small smile as Jake approached. "I heard about the trouble," she said, handing him the basket. "Just wanted to say thank you. People are talking about what you've done." Jake took the basket, his expression unreadable. "Just trying to do my part," he said simply. Mrs. Thompson hesitated. "They'll come back, won't they?" Jake met her gaze. "Not if I can help it." She nodded, her worry not entirely eased, but she seemed reassured by Jake's quiet confidence. By midday, whispers had spread through Willow Creek. Customers who came into the shop offered knowing glances, their voices lowered as they asked about the gang. Jake answered with the same calm responses, brushing off their concerns without revealing too much. He didn't need recognition for what he had done. He just needed the town to stand strong. That evening, Jake gathered Emma and Liam in the living room. Emma sat cross-legged on the couch, her sketchbook in hand, while Liam tinkered with a small robot he had been building for weeks. They looked up as Jake cleared his throat, his expression serious but calm. "I want to talk to you both," he began, his voice steady. "You might hear people in town talking about trouble with some outsiders. I want you to know, it's handled." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Handled how, Dad? Is this about those guys from the diner?" Jake nodded. "They tried to cause problems. They're gone now." Emma frowned, her sketchbook forgotten. "Gone. Just like that." Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Sometimes people think they can push others around to get what they want. They rely on fear, but fear only works if you let it." Liam's eyes widened. "You're not scared of them, are you?" Jake smiled faintly, reaching out to ruffle his son's hair. "No, buddy. I'm not scared of them." Emma wasn't convinced. "You're being vague again, Dad. You always say it's handled. But how? Did they just leave?" Jake sighed, meeting her gaze. "They realize this isn't a town they can mess with. That's all you need to know." Emma stared at him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. She didn't push further, but Jake could see the questions lingering in her eyes. He didn't blame her. She was smart, observant, and fiercely protective in her own way, traits she had inherited from her mother. As the night settled in, Jake returned to his usual place on the porch, Max at his feet. The town was quiet again, but Jake knew it wouldn't last forever. Scarface and his crew might be gone for now, but there would always be others. The world was full of people who preyed on fear and weakness, and Jake had sworn to never let them take root in Willow Creek. The faint glow of the porch light cast long shadows across the yard. Jake leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on Max's head. For now, his family was safe, and the town was secure. But he would stay ready. He always did. As he looked out into the night, his thoughts returned to the life he had built. The quiet, steady existence he had fought so hard to create. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And no one, not Scarface, not any gang, would ever take that from him. Not while he still had the strength to fight. The quiet warrior. The night in Willow Creek was eerily calm, but Jake Morgan knew better. Calm wasn't always peace. It was often the silence before the storm. He sat on his porch, Max resting at his feet, the soft breeze carrying with it the faint scent of pine. The town was sleeping, its people blissfully unaware of how close they had come to danger. Jake, however, was wide awake, his senses sharp and his instincts honed. He had spent weeks dismantling the gang's operation, turning their fear tactics against them. Scarface and his crew had underestimated him. They'd seen a quiet man running a hardware shop and assumed he was an easy target. But Jake wasn't just a man. They had unwittingly gone up against a soldier who had faced far worse threats in far more hostile places. Jake's hands tightened on the porch railing as he stared into the night. His mind replayed the events of the past days, the gang's escalating threats, their attacks on his property, and their ultimate retreat. But something lingered, a nagging thought that refused to be silenced. Scarface wasn't the kind of man to disappear without a fight. Jake knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The morning brought a sense of false normalcy to Willow Creek. The sun rose over the small town, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. Jake woke early, as he always did, and prepared breakfast for Emma and Liam. The clinking of plates and the sizzle of eggs filled the kitchen, masking the tension that hung in the air. Emma joined him first, her hair tied in a loose braid. She sat at the table, her expression pensive. "Dad," she started, her voice hesitant, "are we really safe? I mean, from them." Jake turned to her, his face calm but serious. "Yes, Emma, they're gone." "But are they really?" she pressed, her brown eyes narrowing. "You're always so calm, but I can tell when you're worried. Are they coming back?" Jake hesitated, the truth balancing on the tip of his tongue. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that the danger was over. But Emma was too smart for half-truths. "They might try," he admitted, sitting down across from her. "But if they do, they won't get far. I promise you that." Emma didn't look satisfied, but she nodded. She trusted him, even if she didn't understand the full scope of what he was capable of. Liam entered the kitchen moments later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He didn't sense the tension, and Jake was grateful for that. He wanted Liam's world to remain simple for as long as possible. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Jake spent the morning at the shop, helping customers and fixing tools. He was meticulous, his hands steady as he worked, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched the street through the shop window, noting every unfamiliar face, every parked car that lingered too long. By the time he closed the shop, the feeling had settled into his chest. Scarface was going to make his move. Jake wasn't sure when, but he was certain it was coming. Men like Scarface didn't retreat without trying to save face. Jake had taken everything from him: his operation, his reputation, his power. Scarface would want to reclaim it, and he wouldn't care about the collateral damage. That evening, Jake gathered Emma and Liam in the living room. The warm glow of the fireplace illuminated their faces as they sat on the couch, watching him with curiosity. "I need you both to do something for me," Jake began, his tone serious but calm. "If anything ever feels wrong, if you hear something outside or see someone you don't recognize, I want you to come straight to me. No hesitation." Emma frowned. "You're scaring us, Dad." "I'm not trying to scare you," Jake said, his voice softening. "I just want you to be prepared. You don't need to worry about what's out there. That's my job. I just need you to trust me." Liam nodded eagerly, his small hands clutching a blanket. "We trust you, Dad." Emma nodded reluctantly, her brows furrowed. She didn't like being left in the dark, but she understood that her father wasn't going to budge. "Okay," she said. "We trust you." Jake smiled faintly. "Good. Now go get ready for bed. It's late." As they climbed the stairs, Jake sat back in his chair, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. He had faced enemies in the dead of night, navigated hostile terrains, and survived situations that most men wouldn't walk away from. But this felt different. This wasn't just a mission. This was his family. And that made the stakes higher than ever. The night was still when it happened. Jake was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Max's low growl broke the silence. Jake froze, his hand tightening around the dish towel. Max stood at the back door, his ears pinned back and his teeth bared. Jake moved to the window, his movements slow and deliberate. The yard was dark, but his sharp eyes caught the faintest movement near the fence. He reached for the flashlight he kept on the counter and clicked it on, aiming the beam into the yard. Two figures froze in the light, their faces obscured by hoods. Jake's heart rate didn't spike. His mind shifted into combat mode, calm and precise. "Max, stay," he ordered softly as he moved toward the back door. He didn't grab the crowbar this time. He didn't need it. As he stepped into the yard, the two intruders backed away, their hands raised in mock surrender. Jake recognized one of them instantly. It was Deke, one of Scarface's men. The other was unfamiliar, but his stance and nervous movements screamed inexperience. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," Jake said, his voice low and controlled. Deke smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a friendly visit, Morgan. Boss wanted us to remind you who's in charge." Jake took another step forward, his flashlight steady in his hand. "I know exactly who's in charge, and it's not Scarface." The younger man shifted uncomfortably, but Deke held his ground. "You think you've won, but you've just made things worse for yourself. Boss is done playing nice." Jake's expression didn't change. "You tell Scarface he's already lost, and if he tries to bring this fight back to my family, he won't just lose his crew, he'll lose everything." Deke hesitated, his bravado faltering. He muttered something under his breath before turning to leave. The younger man followed quickly, casting one last nervous glance at Jake before disappearing into the darkness. Jake stood in the yard for a long moment, the flashlight still in his hand. Max padded up to him, his tail wagging cautiously. "Good boy," Jake murmured, scratching the dog's head. As he walked back inside, Jake locked the door behind him and checked on Emma and Liam. They were sound asleep, unaware of what had just transpired. Jake sat on the edge of Liam's bed, brushing a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered, "no matter what." The night stretched on, but Jake didn't sleep. He sat in the living room, the weight of his promise heavy on his shoulders. Scarface had sent his message, but Jake had sent his own. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for everything he held dear. And Jake Morgan was a man who never lost when it mattered most.